Welcome, take a slow breath, let your body relax. Long before the world learned the weight of iron and steel, before empires rose with towering walls and written laws, human civilization rested quietly upon the soft glow of bronze, an age where kingdoms were connected not by conquest alone but by trade, trust, and fragile balance, stretching from the shores of the Aegean to the valleys of Mesopotamia, from the sunlit cities of Egypt to the distant mountains of Anatolia. This was a world carefully built, slowly shaped over centuries, where copper and tin traveled vast distances across land and sea, binding civilizations together in a web so complex and delicate that few understood how deeply dependent they had become on one another. Ships moved calmly across the Mediterranean, carrying bronze ingots, grain, textiles, and ideas, while scribes pressed symbols into clay tablets, recording treaties, marriages, and promises between kings who believed this order would last forever. Great cities stood proud beneath open skies. Mycenae rose with stone walls thick and confident. Hattusa watched over Anatolia with guarded strength. Ugarit thrived as a quiet port of connection and diplomacy. Egypt flowed steadily along the Nile, timeless and assured, its temples glowing softly beneath the sun. Life moved at a measured pace. Farmers followed familiar seasons. Artisans shaped metal with practiced hands. Messengers crossed borders carrying words instead of weapons. Bronze was more than a material. It was the foundation of weapons, tools, rituals, and power itself. Kings ruled because bronze allowed them to protect, to trade, and to command. Armies marched because bronze armed them. Cities flourished because bronze connected them. And in this world, stability felt natural, almost eternal. Yet beneath this calm surface, unseen pressures were quietly building. The system that held the Bronze Age together was vast but fragile, relying on long trade routes, stable climates, obedient populations, and unbroken communication. A disruption in one corner could ripple silently across the entire network. Few noticed this vulnerability, because prosperity creates confidence, and confidence dulls caution. The people of the Bronze Age did not fear collapse. They believed their cities were permanent, their gods attentive, their alliances secure. Each sunrise over stone walls and busy harbors reinforced the illusion that the world they knew would continue unchanged. But history, patient and indifferent, was already beginning to shift. Not with fire or invasion, but with subtle imbalance. A missed shipment, a failed harvest, a distant unrest. Small enough to ignore, quiet enough to dismiss. And so the Bronze Age continued to shine, unaware that it stood at the edge of a transformation so profound that its entire world would soon fade into silence, leaving behind ruins, myths, and unanswered questions resting quietly beneath the dust of time. As the Bronze Age reached the height of its calm and carefully maintained order, the first signs of collapse did not arrive with thunder or sudden destruction, but with quiet disruptions that seemed small enough to ignore, subtle changes that blended into daily life and were dismissed as temporary misfortune rather than warnings of a deeper fracture forming beneath the surface of the ancient world. Seasons began to shift in unfamiliar ways. Rains arrived late or not at all. Fields that had fed cities for generations produced less grain, and farmers watched the skies with growing unease, sensing that the rhythms they depended on were no longer reliable. In distant regions, drought stretched on year after year, weakening harvests and forcing populations to migrate slowly, not as invading armies, but as desperate families searching for survival. These movements placed pressure on borders that had once remained peaceful, and small tensions quietly grew into persistent unrest. At the same time, the great trade networks that sustained the Bronze Age began to strain under their own complexity. Ships failed to arrive on schedule. Tin became harder to obtain. Copper shipments were delayed or interrupted entirely. A broken route in one land caused shortages in another, and the interconnected system that once ensured prosperity now revealed its fragility. Kings sent messengers demanding explanations. Scribes recorded complaints instead of treaties. Warehouses that once overflowed now echoed with emptiness. Within the cities, authority slowly weakened. Rulers who had depended on wealth and bronze to secure loyalty found their power questioned as resources diminished. Soldiers were still armed, but their pay arrived late. Workers grew restless. Faith in leaders began to erode, not suddenly, but steadily, like stone worn smooth by water. In some regions, rebellions flared briefly and faded, leaving behind fear rather than resolution. In others, internal conflict simmered beneath the surface, hidden behind formal ceremonies and ritual promises that no longer reassured the people. Even communication, once the strength of the Bronze Age world, began to falter. Messages failed to reach their destinations. Alliances weakened as trust dissolved. A delayed response could mean the difference between stability and chaos, and delays became common. Across the ancient world, from the palaces of Mycenaean Greece to the courts of Anatolia and the temples of the Levant, the same quiet pattern emerged. Systems strained. Confidence faded. The sense of permanence slowly dissolved. Yet still, few believed the world itself was ending. Each kingdom assumed the trouble lay elsewhere. Each ruler believed their city would endure while others faltered. At the same time, the great trade networks that sustained the Bronze Age began to strain under their own complexity. Ships failed to arrive on schedule. Tin became harder to obtain. Copper shipments were delayed or interrupted entirely. A broken route in one land caused shortages in another, and the interconnected system that once ensured prosperity now revealed its fragility. Kings sent messengers demanding explanations. Scribes recorded complaints instead of treaties. Warehouses that once overflowed now echoed with emptiness. Within the cities, authority slowly weakened. Rulers who had depended on wealth and bronze to secure loyalty found their power questioned as resources diminished. Soldiers were still armed, but their pay arrived late. Workers grew restless. Faith in leaders began to erode, not suddenly, but steadily, like stone worn smooth by water. In some regions, rebellions flared briefly and faded, leaving behind fear rather than resolution. In others, internal conflict simmered beneath the surface, hidden behind formal ceremonies and ritual promises that no longer reassured the people. Even communication, once the strength of the Bronze Age world, began to falter. Messages failed to reach their destinations. Alliances weakened as trust dissolved. A delayed response could mean the difference between stability and chaos, and delays became common. Across the ancient world, from the palaces of Mycenaean Greece to the courts of Anatolia and the temples of the Levant, the same quiet pattern emerged. Systems strained. Confidence faded. The sense of permanence slowly dissolved. Yet still, few believed the world itself was ending. Each kingdom assumed the trouble lay elsewhere. Each ruler believed their city would endure while others faltered. This belief allowed the collapse to advance unnoticed, spreading gently and relentlessly, until the Bronze Age stood balanced on the edge of a transformation it could no longer prevent, waiting for the moment when these scattered signs would merge into a single, unstoppable unraveling. When the fragile balance of the Bronze Age world could no longer hold, the collapse moved from quiet warning to visible change. And from the edges of the known world came figures remembered not as a single nation, but as a shadowy movement later called the Sea Peoples, groups whose origins were unclear and whose arrival felt less like invasion and more like the unstoppable motion of a tide. Along the coastlines of the eastern Mediterranean, unfamiliar ships appeared, their sails cutting silently across the water, carrying families, warriors, and entire cultures displaced by drought, famine, and the slow breakdown of the lands they once called home. These were not armies driven solely by conquest, but communities in motion, pushed forward by necessity and drawn toward regions that still held resources and stability. Coastal cities felt the pressure first. Ports that once welcomed traders now faced uncertainty. Some resisted. Others opened their gates. Many were simply overwhelmed. Ugarit, once a thriving center of diplomacy and trade, fell quiet, its final letters describing fear and confusion as help failed to arrive. Mycenaean palaces burned, their great halls collapsing into ash and silence. Hittite authority dissolved as communication failed and borders fractured. Even Egypt, powerful and ancient, felt the weight of the storm, recording desperate battles fought not for expansion, but for survival itself. The collapse did not unfold as a single event, but as a sequence of failures that reinforced one another. Trade networks shattered. Armies disbanded. Cities were abandoned rather than conquered. Writing systems disappeared as administrations collapsed. Knowledge that had been carefully preserved for centuries was suddenly lost, not through destruction alone, but through neglect and absence. The Sea Peoples moved on, leaving behind empty harbors, ruined walls, and landscapes transformed by silence. What remained was not a conquered world, but a broken one, where the structures that defined the Bronze Age no longer functioned. Power fragmented. Travel became dangerous. Once great cities were reduced to small settlements clinging to survival. The world that had been built on bronze could no longer sustain itself, and as the waves continued to break softly against ruined shores, the ancient order finally gave way, fading not with a final cry, but with a long, quiet exhale into history. after the great systems of the Bronze Age had unraveled and the noise of destruction slowly faded, the ancient world entered a long and unfamiliar silence. A silence not marked by celebration or renewal, but by absence, where once busy roads lay empty. Harbors no longer echoed with voices, and cities that had thrived for centuries stood quiet beneath open skies, their walls crumbling gently as nature reclaimed what human ambition had built. In the years that followed the collapse, survivors did not rebuild quickly or boldly, but cautiously and humbly, settling in smaller communities, relying on memory rather than records, and passing knowledge through spoken word instead of written tablets, as writing itself disappeared from many regions for generations. Palaces that once governed trade and diplomacy became ruins visited only by wind and dust. Temples lost their priests. Administrative centers fell silent, their clay archives buried beneath layers of soil, waiting thousands of years to be rediscovered. The great interconnected world that had once stretched across seas and continents fractured into isolated pockets of survival, each adapting slowly to a harsher and less predictable reality. Travel became rare and dangerous. Long-distance trade faded into memory. Bronze, once the foundation of power and order, grew scarce, and with it vanished the old hierarchies that had depended on centralized control. Kings were replaced by local leaders. Empires dissolved into regions. The certainty that had defined daily life during the height of the Bronze Age gave way to uncertainty, but also to quiet resilience. People learned to live with less. They shaped simpler tools. They built smaller homes. They measured time not by prosperity, but by endurance. And yet, this silence was not an ending, but a pause. Within abandoned fields and forgotten ruins, seeds of a new world slowly took root. From the ashes of collapsed systems emerged new ways of living, new forms of warfare, and new cultures shaped by hard lessons learned from fragility and overdependence. Iron would eventually replace bronze. Smaller societies would grow into new powers. Stories of the old world would survive as myths, sung by poets who no longer understood their origins. Troy would become legend. Fallen cities would become cautionary tales. And the memory of a world once united by trade, trust, and bronze would fade into the background of human consciousness. As centuries passed, grass covered broken stones, and silence settled fully over the lands that had once defined an age. The storm had ended. The noise was gone. What remained was time itself, moving slowly forward, carrying humanity into a new chapter written not with certainty, but with adaptation, reminding those who would come later that even the most stable worlds can vanish quietly, and that history often ends not with a final cry, but with a gentle, enduring stillness. And even long after the last echoes of the Bronze Age had faded from memory, the land itself continued to remember what humanity had forgotten, as broken stones rested quietly beneath layers of soil, and collapsed walls slept beneath fields where shepherds walked without knowing the stories buried under their feet, while generations grew up unaware that the ground they lived upon had once supported palaces, archives, and thriving networks that connected the ancient world. Time moved slowly through this silence. Children learned new ways of living without written laws or distant kings. Communities relied on oral memory, on shared labor, and on the careful observation of nature rather than vast systems of control. The past became distant and unclear, reshaped into myths whispered beside fires and stories told without dates or names. What had once been history transformed gently into legend. The collapse, once feared and devastating, became invisible, absorbed into the rhythm of everyday survival. Yet this forgetting was not failure, but adaptation. Humanity endured by simplifying, by rebuilding patiently, by allowing complexity to rest until the world was ready to carry it again. Centuries later, new tools would rise, new cities would grow, and new empires would form, never fully realizing how closely their foundations echoed the forgotten age beneath them. The Bronze Age did not truly disappear. It settled quietly into the earth, into memory, into silence, becoming a lesson written not in warning, but in stillness. And as night falls once more over these ancient lands, the ruins remain calm, the past remains gentle, and history itself seems to breathe slowly, reminding us that even the greatest ages do not end with noise or fire, but with time, patience, and a long, peaceful rest. And as the centuries unfolded, stretching far beyond the memory of those who had once walked the bustling streets and towering palaces of the Bronze Age, the echoes of human endeavor continued to whisper quietly beneath the surface of the earth. Not through monuments or preserved records, but through the subtle rhythms of the land itself. Rivers carved gentle paths over abandoned city walls. Winds brushed over broken stones. Sunlight fell softly on fields that had once been filled with life. In distant villages and emerging communities, people learned to live by observation and adaptation rather than by rigid law or written decree. Knowledge was passed orally from one generation to the next. Stories were shaped into myths. Practical lessons transformed into gentle warnings. The memory of a vanished world guided them in ways both conscious and unconscious. Although the glory of kings, the splendor of palaces, and the authority of once powerful civilizations had faded, the influence of their existence lingered in the patterns of trade that survived on smaller scales. Knowledge of metals and tools was refined slowly over time. Awareness grew that human life, though fragile, could persist beyond collapse. As centuries passed, new cities rose cautiously from the earth. Founders unknowingly walked upon foundations laid by long-forgotten hands. Structures echoed the logic, ingenuity, and organization of the past while blending with new rhythms and necessities. New empires emerged, shaped not by the sudden brilliance of conquest, but by the careful observation of survival, endurance, and adaptation. In the quiet of night, when the stars rose above lands once ruled by bronze, when the winds carried faint whispers across empty fields and ruined walls, and when people slept beneath skies that had watched generations rise and fall, the spirit of the Bronze Age breathed softly once more through the earth. Memory and human consciousness reminded all who would listen that even the greatest ages, even those that crumble without fanfare, leave behind traces that shape the future. They teach patience, resilience, and humility. History itself does not end with noise or fire, but with quiet persistence, gentle transformation, and the unbroken flow of time. As the night deepens, the past, present, and future converge into a single, calm continuum. A lasting lesson remains: all things pass, yet all things leave whispers that guide what comes next. A final, peaceful closure settles over the world like a soft, eternal breath. In this stillness, the Bronze Age rests completely. Its stories are now part of the slow, continuous rhythm of life. Humanity learns that endings are never abrupt. Silence can hold knowledge. Even in disappearance, there is continuity, patience, and the gentle, unending pulse of time.